Hey, it's Dante, and welcome back to my channel for another true crime case. Guys, I'm super excited to have another video for you guys. It's honestly been truly incredible and unbelievable to hear that you guys actually like my content. I mean, I say this in every single video, but it's truly just so crazy. I mean, my first video that I made got about 3,000 views as of right now, which is so insane, and I just want to thank every single person who watched and every single person who decided to subscribe and stay, because I hope that my content keeps informing you about different cases, and I hope you guys truly enjoy it and are entertained but also interested in these cases, but also I hope they're making a change of some sort. I want to give a voice to the people that don't have a voice anymore, and so I hope that my content is able to do that. So that's my first little thing that I wanted to say. The second thing that I wanted to say, sorry guys, I'm blushing, my brother just came in the room and I'm not like telling anyone that I'm making YouTube anymore because it's like kind of a secret, but whatever. So the second thing I want to say is that I'm actually going to be making a Google form for you guys, and I want to have people be able to send me cases that they want me to do, and I'll definitely read through as many as I can. I probably won't get to do them all. I mean, this depends on how many suggestions I get. I could get 0, I could get 100, I don't really know. So, I'll, comb through those cases, see which ones I'm interested in, and definitely add them to my list. I have like a cute little list right now of cases that I want to do. I have my next like 2 or 3 planned out, but after that, I don't really know. Okay, so guys, let's get into the case of Mathew Shephard. So Mathew Shephard is a case that I learned about a couple years ago for the first time, and it's truly a really, really sad case, and the reason why it is pretty well known, I mean, it's well known in the LGBT rights section of the world as it is a crime that is associated with LGBT, but this case is actually frequently debated if it was a hate crime or if it was a drug-induced rage. And so we're gonna get into that, and you guys can kind of comment down below what you think might have been the cause of this case or what fueled the perpetrator's crimes and what made them want to do what they did. Okay, so Mathew Shepard was born on December 1st of 1976 in Casper, Wyoming. His parents were Judy and Dennis Shepard. In his childhood, he was said to have a really close relationship with his younger brother, Logan, who was born in 1981, and Mathew was described as being very friendly to anyone that he came across in school or in his everyday life, and he was just described as being someone who was really open to talking to new people and wanted to meet as many people as he could. So overall, I mean, I couldn't find too many details about his childhood other than it was just pretty normal. I mean, I don't really know what life in Wyoming is like, but it's, been described as pretty normal and not much happened in his younger years. However, when he was a teenager, he started to get targeted a little bit for bullying as people picked on him for his small stature and lack of athleticism, which just means like he wasn't really good at sports, which I'm not either, but he wasn't the best, and so I guess that did make him a target among other boys. So while he was in high school, his father actually got hired for a company called Saudi Aramco Oil Company, and they hired Mathew's father, and this caused them to move to Tehran, where he then went to the American school in Switzerland. I'm assuming it was a boarding school if they lived in Tehran, which is in, I believe, Saudi Arabia, and then I think they sent him to the American school in Switzerland. So while he was on a trip with his high school, they visited Morocco, which is in Africa. It's not clear who did this to Mathew, but he was beaten and raped by some people on the trip. I'm not sure if it was people on the trip or if it was just somebody that he had met in Morocco, but he was sexually assaulted and beaten. After this, a lot of his friends said that he truly did change as a person and that he was never really the same happy person that he was. They said he had a panic disorder related to this incident, and he would have a lot of panic attacks which related to this, and he also developed depression because of this as well. So in May of 1995, he graduated from this school and he decided to go to the University of Wyoming in Laramie, and he wanted to major in politics with minors in 2 languages. Not sure what they were, but he was, a worldly person, and he had traveled a lot in his teenage years, and I think he wanted to continue doing that when he was older. His father during this time had described him as an optimistic and accepting young man who had a special gift of relating to almost everyone. He was the type of person who was very approachable and always looked to new challenges. Mathew had a great passion for equality and always stood up for the acceptance of people's differences. So while in high school, Mathew was openly gay, which at the time in like the 1990s was not really accepted. I mean, there was obviously some people who didn't really care, but then there were definitely a group of people who had issues with it. Obviously more conservative households definitely did not like this, and so I don't know if he was targeted in high school for that as well. I'm assuming he probably was, but it's not really talked about, but he was openly gay, which is kind of important to know. So while at college, one of Mathew's close friends has alleged that he was on drugs during his time at college, and his mom had actually confirmed this as well, saying that he struggled a lot with drug use, which was related to kind of numb his past and numb the pain that he had suffered from that attack that had happened in high school when he was sexually assaulted, and he had actually been hospitalized for thoughts of suicide during his college years, and also for people being afraid that he would overdose on drugs. So that is kind of a little backstory on Mathew Shephard, who seemed just like a really nice person. I don't know, I feel like I would have gotten along with him, and now we're going to talk more about what actually happened to him. So on October 6th of 1998, so this was a couple years after he started college at the University of Wyoming, Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson went to a bar called the Fireside Lounge, which is a bar which was known for having a lot of young college kids go there because it was right next to, you know, a couple colleges like the University of Wyoming and other colleges I think were nearby as well. And so all three of them were there, and these two men had gone up to Matthew and started talking to him, and Matthew claimed that he was too drunk and he would need a ride home, and the two men offered. And they also allegedly, which we'll kind of talk about later, had claimed that they were also gay and maybe interested in Matthew. And so he obviously, you know, was excited by this, as there were probably a lot of out gay people, and he wanted to go with them and, you know, see what could happen. So after talking to Matthew for a while, they decided he would be an easy target to rob. He was incapacitated by the amount of alcohol he had had, and he was also just an overall pretty small person. This part of the story is kind of hard to know what truly happens, but this is kind of the accepted version that the cops have adopted, and also the parents. So on the drive, allegedly Matthew had put his hand on McKinney's knee, and McKinney did not like this, as they were not gay, they just said they were, and so I guess he felt threatened, did not like this, and so he hit Matthew with the pistol, and that was the first kind of moment of the attack. The two men then drove Matthew to a rural area where there wasn't a lot of people and continued to beat him, pistol whip him, and torture him. After they were done, you know, beating him and robbing him, they decided to tie him to a buck fence where they left him, and, you know, they didn't really know if he was alive, they didn't really care if he was alive, but they decided that they needed to go as quickly as possible because they didn't want to get caught with him being right there. So they decided to drive back into town, and they had gotten, I believe, Matthew's keys, and they knew his address because I think it was on his license, and so they wanted to go to his house to continue robbing him because I believe he only had $30 on him and a credit card, so they did not get as much money as they were hoping to. So while they were in town, they actually ran into these two Hispanic men named Emiliano Morales and Jeremy Herrera. So, for some reason, it's kind of unclear. These two men just seemed very violent. They decided to pick a fight with these people. Maybe it was because of money, I'm not really sure. But both Morales and McKinney had gotten head wounds as a result of the fight, so it was kind of serious, as you can tell. And the police were called to the scene, where they arrested Henderson and decided to search McKinney's truck, because that's kind of what you do during an arrest. You have to make sure there's no weapons on the other people. And while they were in his truck, they found Matthew's shoes, which were completely bloodied, and a bloody pistol as well, along with his credit card. And so they kind of thought this was, you know, an emergency, and they knew that, you know, somebody was clearly beaten senseless, and so they, you know, took this into evidence. So now we're going to skip forward about 18 hours after Matthew was originally tied to the fence. A cyclist had been driving through on this rural road, I'm assuming it was just kind of like part of his trip, and he had noticed that on this buck fence that there was a scarecrow looking thing. And when he got closer, he realized this wasn't a scarecrow, this was a person. And he then immediately found, I think, somebody to call the police. But the first person to arrive at the scene was a woman named Reggie Fletty, who was a police officer. And she discovered that Matthew was still alive, and so she wanted to help him, and because she saw that he was completely covered in blood, she knew that she had to clear his airway, and so she tried to reach into his mouth, but her gloves were faulty. So since the gloves weren't working, she just decided in order to save this boy's life, she was going to have to use her bare hands. So she took off the gloves, and she reached in and cleared his airway, and thankfully she did clear his airway, and the ambulance were able to come, and he was still alive, and they took him to the hospital. They actually specifically took him to the Ivinson Memorial Hospital, which was in Laramie, and then he was in too severe conditions, so they had to send him to the trauma ward in a bigger hospital, which was called the Poudre Valley Hospital in Fort Collins, Colorado. So immediately the doctors wanted to do some basic observations, and so when they looked at him, they saw that he had fractures on the back of his head and on his right ear. And they did a couple more tests and a couple more observations, and they discovered that he also had brainstem damage. And this brainstem damage was so severe that it inhibited his body from being able to control his heart rate, body temperature, and other vital functions. And because of this damage, he was unable to control any of those things. Doctors decided that it would be impossible for them to operate on him, and so they sadly had to leave him on life support because his body was just unable to function on its own. The detail that really stuck out for me that I was reading about that I don't know why I didn't mention until the very end was that when they were doing observations, they had actually seen that his body was completely covered in blood except for his eyes, which were not bloody because there were tears and that had washed away some of the blood. So like, I just want you to understand like the severity of this crime and why it was such like a big deal for this area, you know what I mean? And it's just, it was crazy for people to even think that they could do this to another person. I mean, it was such a big deal because of how violent and bloody this crime was and just horrendous. So I just wanted to add that in. While in the hospital, the doctors also decided to run a couple more tests, blood tests and all of that important stuff. And while they did, they found that he was HIV positive. And so, you know, this is quite shocking. I mean, during this time, the stereotype was that a lot of gay men had AIDS and HIV. And so, you know, it must have been really sad that he was dealing with this all alone. And, you know, he told one of his friends that, you know, he was HIV positive and that it was really hard for him to live with this. And that it was just another reason that he was, you know, very depressed because, you know, it's kind of like the stereotype, oh, gay men have this, and then for him to actually get it must have been so hard, and, you know, I can't really imagine knowing that. So they told his parents, who, you know, did not know, and the mom said it was very traumatic for her to find out that her, you know, son had HIV and was HIV positive while he was laying there dying, and she, you know, never get to comfort him and tell him that it's okay. They also had to tell the police officer who helped him because she had used her bare hand and she actually had cuts all over her hand, so she could have, you know, theoretically gotten some of the blood inside of her and she could have gotten HIV, but thankfully she did not test HIV positive and they had tested her a couple times, so, you know, she was all good. So 6 days after the attack, Matthew was pronounced dead at 12:53 a.m. on October 12th of 1998, and he was just 21 years old at the time. So originally, after they had found Matthew's body, they charged McKinney and Henderson with attempted murder, robbery, and kidnapping, and then when he was finally pronounced dead, they decided to make it just murder. And so because it had been moved to murder, they were now able to give him the death penalty if he was found guilty of murder, both of the people. The girlfriends, Kristen Price and Chastity Paisley, were also charged with accessory. I tried to find out why. I think they might have just known, because they were not in the car at the time, or the bar, I don't believe, but they were charged with accessory. I guess they knew that this had happened, or maybe they knew that they were planning to go rob somebody and they didn't do anything. While they were doing their investigation, they discovered that McKinney had a really bad addiction to methamphetamines, and one of the kind of, not symptoms, but effects that methamphetamine can have on a person is it makes them really violent and it makes them really addicted, and they will go to such violent extremes to make sure that they can get their meth so that they were able to use it. Henderson claims that the week before the murder, they had been on a hardcore bender and they had been using frequently, which just means that they were really in deep with their drug use and they were just not in the right state of mind during this murder. So at McKinney's pre-trial hearing, Sergeant Rob Dupree said McKinney had said in a previous interview that the two men had pretended to be gay in order to lure Matthew out to the truck. So that was how they tried to get his trust, was by pretending to be gay and interested in him. McKinney then said that he only decided to attack Matthew after he had put his hand on his knee, as he felt like this was a violation of his body. Detective Ben Fritzen also testified that Price stated McKinney told her the violence against Shepard was triggered by how McKinley felt against the gays. Basically, this implied that the girlfriend said that McKinney, you know, had used so much rage in this crime was because Matthew was gay. However, she later recanted this statement, saying that that wasn't exactly the truth. However, we'll never really know what was true and what wasn't. So on December of 1998, Paisley had pled guilty to accessory to murder, and on April 5th of 1999, Henderson had pled guilty to murder. In order to have the death penalty off the table, he also had to testify against his friend McKinney, and as part of his sentence, he was given 2 life sentences. Henderson also wanted to make it very clear that this was not a hate crime. That was what he said. So then McKinney's trial, which is the other guy that's involved in this case, had occurred through October and November of 1999, so a year after his death. And McKinney's girlfriend was an important witness in this, as she was the one who stated that he was pretending to be gay in order to get close to Matthew and earn his trust. So McKinney's lawyer then tried to use the gay panic defense, which just basically means that if you find out somebody is gay or they make a move on you and you're not interested in them because they're gay, you have the right to attack them. Or not even the right, but that's, you know, what happened to him is that he completely lost his mind and was temporarily insane because Matthew had tried to make a move on him. But remember, these are two bigger men, and Matthew's a really small boy, so they, you know, didn't really buy this. The judge actually rejected this defense completely, as he found it was just ridiculous to even insinuate that was possible. So throughout the rest of the case, they had presented their arguments, and the jury had found McKinney not guilty of premeditated murder, which means that he didn't have the intent of going in and murdering Matthew Shepard, but he is guilty of felony murder, and they were still deciding if the death penalty was going to be an option for him. So Matthew's parents then decided to make a deal. They would give him 2 life sentences, which a life sentence, actually, I have to look this up, is 15 years, so that's 30 years without the chance of parole. And so that was kind of the final act, as now everyone who was involved in this crime was now paying for their crime in some sort of way. So let's talk a little bit about like remembering Matthew and how people remembered him. So throughout the case, many candlelight vigils were held as people were appalled to hear about this crime, and a lot of people did feel like it was fueled by hate. So what made this case even bigger than, you know, the fact that it might have been a hate crime was that at Matthew's funeral, a lot of people from the Westboro Baptist Church had actually come to protest. And so this group of people is led by a man who, his slogan is God Hates FAGS. He runs a website now called God Hates. And so basically they had gone to his funeral to protest his life. And instead of just letting the families bury him with dignity, they had to protest this. And a lot of them had signs like Matt in hell and God hates. And in response to this, I mean, people were appalled. Why can't you just let them bury this poor guy? One of Matthew's friends decided that it might be a cool idea if they all wore white robes and had these giant white angel wings and blocked the protesters from the funeral procession, so that way the family would kind of have some privacy. However, this was simply not enough, and they could still hear the protesters during the funeral, and so this is when the police actually stepped in and made another blockade sort of thing, so the protesters could not interfere with this poor kid's death. So after, you know, the funeral and everything was over, the mom, Judy, decided that she wanted to spend the rest of her life being an activist and an advocate for LGBT rights. And so she wanted to fight for people like her son, Matthew Shepard. And so her and her husband, Dennis, decided to create the Matthew Shepard Foundation to commemorate him, which shares his story, and you can donate, and I think its goal is to help LGBT youth. So in June of 2019, he was actually, so this is very recent, last year, he was inducted into the LGBTQ Wall of Honor at Stonewall. And that's kind of just like a really cool monument, as I think there's only 50 people that have been inducted so far. And it's cool that he was able to kind of join, you know, the group there. And something else that they wanted to do, the family, was pass an act known as the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, which was eventually passed by Obama. And this act was actually originally created in 1999, however it took till 2008 or 9, I believe, for it to actually get passed, which expands hate crimes to include sexual orientation and puts a lot more protections on people with sexual orientation and preventing discrimination and such. So now, this is the kind of last aspect of the case that I want to talk about, is was this a hate crime or was it drug-induced rage? So a lot of people believe that this was a hate crime because the 2 men had posed as gay in order to gain Matthew's trust, and the reason why they're so violent and vicious towards him, and one of the reasons they chose him, was because he was gay. And that is kind of what people use, and that is what is kind of the narrative that's been thrown around in the whole world. And he was inducted into the Hall of Fame because this was a crime that really sped up the LGBT rights movement. I mean, before this, it was kind of okay for businesses to maybe turn away gay people, or for people to hate crime gay people and not get as severe crimes for it. And this case actually, you know, because of the legislation that was passed, stopped a lot of future crimes from occurring because they were able to toughen the restrictions and send people to jail for longer if it was a hate crime. And so, yes, like overall this is accepted as a hate crime case. However, a couple of years after the case and the murder and everything, people had talked to McKinney and Henderson, and they still say that this was not caused by his sexual orientation, that they didn't really care, and that he was simply chosen because they needed to have an easy target so they could fuel their methamphetamine addiction. And it just happened to be Matthew Shepard, who just happened to be gay. And a lot of experts say that this is also a very plausible story because methamphetamines makes you very, very violent, and I mean, that could explain why this crime was so intense. I mean, if you look at the crime scene, well, you can't really find the crime scene, but if you study the crime scene, you read about it, he was completely covered in bruises, fractures, covered in blood. They said that the only place that didn't have blood were where his tears were. And so this was a clearly violent crime. A lot of people believe that the violence was caused by the drugs and not necessarily a hatred. Whatever you believe, I mean, you have to make your own conclusion about this. It could have been a little bit of both. It could have just been like, well, he is gay, let's attack him. Or he's an easy target, he's small and he's gay, so we can take him. You know, I mean, we'll never truly know why they did this. But it doesn't really matter because someone so young who has so much to live for lost his life so brutally. So it doesn't really matter how he died, I guess. It just matters that he's gone. And, you know, I think it's really important that we remember this case. Matthew deserved so much more and so much better than he got. You know, his young life, he was exploited, sexually assaulted. He was on drugs because he had no other way to cope with this. And it's just so sad that this is the way that his life had to end. And I truly, truly, truly feel awful for him and his family. And I hope that they were able to get closure through knowing these people will be in jail and no longer able to hurt people for a long, 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 long time. So yeah, guys, that concludes this case. I hope you found this video interesting and definitely informative. I want to kind of cover a wider range of victims, and I feel like, you know, let's start with gay people, let's start with, you know, different types of people, and I want my cases to just be all across the board of victimology. So yeah, guys, thank you so much for watching my video again. I hope you subscribe if you want to see more content like this. I'm going to be posting a lot more true crime, and yeah, that's all I gotta say. Thanks.